This is an ACU Centre for Liturgy podcast. Speaking of liturgy. Music in the liturgy can unite and lift the spirits of worshippers in a unique way, bringing joy to the heart. Speaking of liturgy, Marty Haugen, liturgical composer and musician, workshop presenter and author, speaks with Cathy Murrowood about instruments and the liturgy and how they can colour and enhance the rites. He offers some advice for using them well and describes some of the challenges that may be encountered.
Welcome, Marty. In worship, we regard the voice as primary and instruments as secondary. Can you tell us what are some of the blessings and challenges of using instruments in worship?
Thank you, Cathy. I'm very happy to be here. When I was taking my studies for Master's in Pastoral Studies, I wrote my Master's thesis on instrumentation in worship. And when I presented it to the board, one of the members, Michael Jonka, said, "Why did you spend so much time on what is secondary rather than the voice?" And I said, because people have to deal with the instruments, whether or not you have them. I mean, Christian worship, probably for 1,000 years, was almost always a cappella, and the voice is always primary. I'm speaking as someone who loves instruments, but I think one of the blessings is instrumentation can inspire, but it can also help give guidance, whether you're helping with a melody that the congregation isn't confident with, or whether you're offering harmonizations that help people better understand where the music is going. If the melody is written well, you would hope the congregation will know where to go instinctively, but instruments can help, especially when congregations are less confident. And you can use a variety of instruments for that. The challenges are that, well, in my own culture in the United States, we have got such a strong ethos of performer audience, and people accidentally call the congregation audience without realizing the implications of that. Instruments can be a barrier as well, and I think those who play the instruments and those who help direct have to be very conscious of how the instruments function in a very different way than they might function in a performance work outside of worship.
The vastly experienced composer for the liturgy, what are some important lessons you've learnt when writing for worship communities?
It's ironic. I don't feel like a vastly experienced composer. In actuality, I don't think of myself as a composer. I think of composers who write people with extensive developmental sections and very complex pieces. I prefer to think of what I do as a craftsperson trying to work for the good of the community. I always think of composers, real composers, like Beethoven writing Ode to Joy, or Sibelius writing Finlandia, or Vaughan Williams writing Sine Nomine. I think, boy, I'm glad they didn't spend a whole career writing church music, or there'd be nothing left for those of us to write. But sometimes the simplest music, especially folk music, I've learned that folk music in many cultures comes from the bottom up, comes out of the voice of where the people want to go, where their voices want to go based on their culture, their experiences with others. And it's the danger for some of us who have been classically trained to try and write top down without thinking about where the congregation's voices would like to go. And also, I always think text first. Text always tells the ones writing the music where the melody should go. And it's something I have learned when writing for worship communities, that I have to listen to them. I always like to write from inside of a community, not from outside in. That's why commissions can be very challenging, because until I know the community, their practice, their joys, their experiences, it's very hard to write for them. In the long run, the things that I've written that have lasted the longest and been the most successful have always been written, I don't know if we could say in collaboration with the community, but certainly with a deep connection with the community.
Some communities are blessed with fine pipe organs. Many also use electronic keyboards. They're not the same. This is a key question, especially for those who are engaged in liturgical preparation. So, what are some of the key differences between the pipe organ and electronic keyboards or pianos?
Well, ideally, pipe organs are constructed, designed and constructed for the worship space in which they are placed. So they treat the entire space as almost like a sounding board for the instrument. I remember walking into King's College Chapel in Cambridge, England, and the organ was playing, and I didn't even know where it was located because it filled the space so well. So a well-designed organ in a good acoustical space treats the entire space like part of the sound. Electronic keyboards, by their very nature, are amplified. So they have to have a source point of amplification. And that's why increasingly, in the United States, until the advent of sound equipment, and in Europe and other places where you had church spaces, you would build ideally for good acoustics so that the people's voices could fill the space. Once we had electronic amplification, especially in the cultures in which I've worked with in the US, you can have carpeted places and acoustically deadening spaces, so you use amplification to make up for the lack of acoustics. And whenever you're working with instruments other than the pipe organ, you have to treat the entire space as one of the elements of sound, and then think about how you make that sound fill the space without overpowering the assembly. I was trained on piano, and I played piano for about 10, 11 years, and then I took organ lessons. And there's a big difference, not just the addition of pedals, but in the way you play the instrument. The organ has the wonderful ability, especially a good pipe organ, of giving you this whole palette of sounds, whereas a piano is much less of a palette, and you play differently. I try and write simply. I write more simply than I would like to write, ideally, because I want the instrument's accompaniment to really help the assembly's voice. It's there not to call attention to itself, but to help the assembly. The organ can change voices and change harmonizations more easily than the piano because it has multiple keyboards and pedals and multiple stops. So the pianist has to use creative ideas. Otherwise, I try and write a very generic accompaniment when I write an accompaniment for the piano, with the idea that the accompanist will use that, and to the degree that he or she is able, try and adapt. So, for instance, if a flute is playing, that gives the pianist the ability to play other parts of the keyboard and let the flute take the upper part. Or if there's a good bass, the pianist can play a little higher and let the bass cover the bottom part. Obviously, that's possible if you have the instruments, and it varies enormously from one congregation to another. If the pianist is the only one accompanying, then that pianist has to be able to cover the whole keyboard in a way that helps the assembly without interfering with their voice. And that can be tricky if the accompanist's not well written.
Well, I think that as we speak about different instruments and worship spaces, it's helpful to think about the acoustical environment. What do you suggest that we need to be aware of in terms of placing and amplifying liturgical musicians?
Ideally, when you're amplifying the instruments, and quite honestly, if the space holds more than 40 or 50 people, and you have an acoustic guitar or an acoustic woodwind or string instrument, you may have to use amplification. you don't want the sound for the assembly to be perceived as coming from a different place from where the person playing is standing or sitting. In other words, if the flute is playing in the front of the church, you don't want to have the sound coming from behind you. So there's this sensitivity to that. The trouble is that acoustical amplification can be very expensive, and yet it becomes very important if you're using instruments other than the organ in order to help the assembly. So the placement of speakers, it's good to ask, well, here's a little trick I learned. I asked a really good acoustician to come and give me an assessment of our space. And the person said, well, for $10,000, we can do this. And then I said, well, what could you do for $5,000? And then $2,000. What could you do for $150? So we started creating a good acoustical experience, but we did it as we could afford it, because a lot of parishes don't have the kind of budget and don't necessarily understand how important it is to hear sound in a realistic and an appropriate place and manner. One of the reasons I went into music instead of going into ordination was I'm absolutely convinced that music is critical. What we sing helps us define our faith. I just read recently someone said that music has become, in a way, a new catechism for people, that they believe what you sing, you remember, and what you remember, you come eventually to believe. And that makes what we sing very important. And if we can't hear clearly, if we don't feel well supported, if the people who are leading us seem to be taking over and not letting us sing, then I think we lose important ability to take on the music as our own and own it. Something wonderful about feeling surrounded by other people singing faith with us versus feeling like you're singing by yourself, or worse, listening to somebody else sing for you.
Yes, music is a great unifier and a great way to certainly express our faith. So we might think about instruments as having great potential to colour liturgical music and to amplify the various liturgical rites we celebrate. What advice do you have about using instruments in different parts of the liturgy, and how might they enhance the different liturgical seasons?
Well, my first parish, when I arrived, there was one flute player and one guitarist. And so what I could do was very limited. And I did everything I could to invite people. And I remember one Sunday when a bassoonist came up and said, I play the bassoon, but I'm sure you don't have any music for me. And I said, well, show up on Wednesday and I'll have music for you. So I spent Monday and Tuesday frantically writing bassoon music. But when you can get more people involved in playing, then you can begin to think about, how can we use this? What does Advent sound like? What does Lent sound like versus Easter? I think we have this vision of Easter being a lot of trumpets and timpanis and Lent being mournful and quiet. There is a certain aspect to that, but you can also do some very effective things by very simple things, like having the piano, once the congregation is singing well, just sort of give them a chord as they start a verse and then drop out and let them hear themselves sing, or drop out the piano if you've got a flute and just have the flute play a line with them. But do that with the sensitivity, like if you're singing O Sacred Head surrounded, then you get to that point and the flute can just take a line by itself with the assembly. So you use the instruments, as you said, to color the music and to also paint the text in a more subtle and yet effective manner. The instruments, you don't need a brass quartet all the time. You can have a single trumpet and maybe have the trumpet play from another place in the church. You have that be effective. Once I heard a wonderful songwriter musician, John Bell, who talked about doing I Heard the Voice of Jesus Say. And they began each verse with someone standing up at a different place in the congregation and starting by saying, I heard the voice of Jesus say, and then the song leader brought the second half of the verse with the whole assembly. So the people listened in a different way, and instruments can do the same thing. I've found less is more over time. When I started in my first parish, I wanted to make every Christmas bigger than the last one. And that's sort of a vicious circle. It doesn't work in the long run because you'll never have enough instruments. But then when I was in a retreat center one winter, and there were just 20 of us there and just a flute player and the piano. And we tried to think, how can we creatively do this in a way that uses those instruments to color a song or a response? And obviously, if you work in a liturgical church like the Catholic Church or some of the Anglican or Episcopalian churches, there's the fixed parts of the liturgy that definitely lend themselves to certain instrumentation. But even those can be changed. The same liturgical setting might be done with different instrumentation during different seasons. So that if you had a setting that could be used during Advent with just a flute, and then Christmas, the same setting done with a number of instruments, it can be very effective to mark the season.
That was Marty Haugen reflecting on using musical instruments in the liturgy and how they can enhance and support worship. The ACU Centre for Liturgy, which provides pastoral formation in liturgy across Australia and beyond, is pleased to provide this podcast, Speaking of Liturgy.